So who were the progressives? And this is and I assure you, this will be on the test, this type of question. The progressive era is an era. It's not a movement, because it's actually a collection of a number of different groups of individuals who have sometimes similar sort of objectives and similar goals in what they're advocating for, but in other cases not. So it's really a collection of groups of reform-minded individuals that are trying to improve American society. And while presidents are important in the progressive era, some of the most significant activism of the progressive era, and the reason why change happens at the grassroots level. As you see in this photo here, you see women activists. In this case, these women are demanding meat inspection. So this would be a reaction from Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, they're basically saying, you know, we're going to eat fresh vegetables. We're not going to eat or buy any meat until we know that our meat is inspected for food quality. So grassroots activism, like women's activists, women were a leading charge for the right to vote. And that was the women's suffrage movement, which comes with the 19th Amendment. That was a development that would never have happened at the federal level had women not demanded it. Progressive individuals even, men who are in the United States government at the time, did not want to agree with the 19th Amendment. But eventually the groundswell of activism from women's rights activists and others became so significant that they had no choice but to do it. Women activists also were really significant in the lobbying of the United States government to abolish child labor. So who were the progressives? They're women like Jane Addams, who of course was one of the most significant women activists at the time. There were also socialists like Eugene V. Debs, who is pictured right here. This is his 1912 campaign flyer for his presidential campaign in the 1912 election. And he was a union leader, a labor leader, and he was a socialist. And then again, you might go back to one of the earlier slides and be like, I thought you said the progressives were usually anti-socialist. And they were, usually, but it's not a movement. And so there are many individuals who say, well, workers' rights and so forth are kind of really important when it comes to the progressive era, and they advocated for them. And sometimes those individuals were socialist individuals, even though many progressives were anti-socialist. They involved politicians like Theodore Roosevelt. They involved environmentalists, the founding of, for example, the Sierra Club to protect the environment, to preserve the pristine forest land and incredible geological features of the United States from logging companies and mining companies. So there's politicians like Theodore Roosevelt who very much champions the middle class, and in many cases working class, and the environment as something that's in the best interest of the country as a whole. This is a newspaper heading that is attacking the monopolies. It's discussing the need for the reform of really the monopolistic control over the government. And that is a big part of the progressive era, what's called trust busting. And Theodore Roosevelt, of course, became well known for that. There were also figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, who is pictured here. He was one of the founding members of the NAACP. So in his sense, he's beginning the modern civil rights movement, effectively demanding equal constitutional protections for African Americans at a time when the United States is very much entrenched in ideas, racial ideas. The Supreme Court has upheld in Plessy versus Ferguson the idea in 1896 of separate but equal. Across the country, cities are segregated. There's widespread discrimination against African American individuals when it comes to education or employment opportunities. Cities are segregated. across the United States. And so some progressives like W.E.B. Du Bois were really beginning the civil rights movement. And that's where their progressive focus was probably more than anything else, despite the fact that there are other progressive individuals who were actually racist at the time. And that's why it's not a movement, but an era. Progressives also included muckrakers, those investigative journalists that I've been mentioning, like Upton Sinclair and Jacob A. Riis. Other changes in the American economy included new developments, new thinking about manufacturing, and also workers. So Henry Ford, who's not exactly a progressive, Henry Ford actually was vehemently anti-union, incredibly anti-union, anti-workers union, to such a point that later in his life, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during the New Deal, had effectively demanded that these type of corporations allow workers to unionize, Henry Ford almost disbanded the Ford Motor Company because he wanted to refuse to sign a collective bargaining agreement with the workers. And the only reason he didn't is because his wife, who at the time had been married to him for 50 years, insisted. She famously said to him something to the effect of, "I've been married to you for 50 years, and I'm leaving you now if you do not sign the collective bargaining agreement with these workers." And the reason she did that was because his son, Edsel Ford, would inherit the business. And basically she was like, "You're putting your anti-unionism thing above the best interest of your son, Edsel Ford." And so Ford becomes unionized. Edsel Ford later takes over Ford Motor Company. So Henry Ford is not exactly a progressive, but he's also associated with something called Fordism, which was a new attitude of his that was largely it was centered around the change in industrial manufacturing, industrial output. So let me give you an idea here. And many of his contemporaries disliked him for this. So we know that Henry Ford, you see pictured here a 1910 Model T. It was a simple car made for the American worker. It was probably the most significant automobile of the 20th century. Henry Ford built this car with his assembly line, which was building on the innovation of Eli Whitney from a century before, the innovation of interchangeable parts, right? That the parts are made to be universal on any machine you're making. And he combined that with the assembly line, the moving assembly line where the car is moved from one stage to the other, and each worker has a job to, attach a wheel or whatever it might be. And this gave you the ability to make cars faster in a greater number and more cheaply than ever before. However, Henry Ford understood that if you're going to mass produce, it's only going to work if you mass consume. So Henry Ford believed in paying workers enough to purchase their own Model T. And that was something that a lot of other businessmen at this time simply did not agree with. But Henry Ford did this not because he was necessarily like a champion of workers' rights necessarily, but more because Henry Ford understood that the modern mass consumption economy, if you're going to produce on that scale, the consumer will have to have the money to buy it. Otherwise, it makes no sense to produce thousands and thousands of Model Ts if you can only sell hundreds of them. So mass production needed mass consumption. So Henry Ford paid his workers more than his contemporaries. And he did it because he understood that this new economy was going to require that people earn enough to be able to consume the mass-produced products that industry was making. And if people didn't have enough, the economy would collapse. In 1910, a Model T was $316, which is roughly $8,000 by, I believe that's a 2019 number, so maybe it's a little bit different, but roughly $8,000 by 21st century standards. So it was an affordable, low-cost car that could be worked on and could be generally purchased by the workers who made it. The progressive era is also associated with an expanded democracy in the United States. And a lot of Americans probably are not aware of this. And this is Hiram Johnson. He's the California governor at the time. It is during the progressive era that the United States passes the 17th Amendment to the American Constitution, which led to the direct elections of senators. So today, you vote for your senators. So before the progressive era, the only individuals that everyday Americans voted for directly was the members of the House of Representatives. So each district would vote for their representatives who would go to the House of Representatives, the lower house of Congress, each serving 2-year terms. The senators were actually, though, appointed by their states, by their state legislatures, and they serve 6-year terms. And it's generally the upper house of the U.S. Congress. And there's 100 senators, 2 for each state. Well, today there's 100 senators, not during the progressive era, of course, because there weren't 50 states. The 17th Amendment, and of course the president is indirectly elected through the Electoral College, but we understand that. So the 17th Amendment results in the direct election of senators. It's a result of the progressive era, and it's an increased level of democracy in the United States. For the first time in American history, Americans will vote directly for their senators in their state elections. The 19th Amendment, which again is not something that Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of the United States when that amendment was passed, that was not something that Woodrow Wilson, of course, a president can't veto an amendment, just so everyone knows, but the 19th Amendment was not something that Woodrow Wilson was super excited about. But the women's suffrage movement was so powerful at the grassroots level that it effectively forced the federal government to amend the Constitution to grant women the right to vote. So expanded democracy in the United States. In some states, like California, governors like Hiram Johnson right here developed things like the initiative and the referendum and the recall of officials. What are those basically? Those are basically, so the recall of officials is in California, if you're governor and you're doing a terrible job in the eyes of the majority of people, then the California legislature can call a special election, and they'll have an election, and they can potentially vote to recall the official and then have another election. And that's actually happened in the 21st century. The governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the actor, he actually became governor after Gray Davis, the California governor, was recalled from office. So voters can recall in some states, not all states, but in states like California, which was very progressive, Wisconsin was a very progressive state, they can recall officials. In many states, you have initiatives where voters can vote on the ballot and vote for things that their actual legislature might not support, but the voters can vote for it and say, we want this to be law. In the state of Florida, for example, the vote on whether or not nonviolent felons should have their right to vote returned after serving their sentence. That is something that the people of Florida voted on directly and decided that overwhelmingly that they wanted that change. And so the progressive era is associated also with an expansion of democracy, direct elections of senators, the 19th Amendment allowing women the right to vote, and on the state level, a number of types of reforms that increase the sort of oversight of everyday Americans in the electoral process.